We are here with the NL Central offseason recap, preview, whatever you want to call it, here at the OK Baseball Podcast. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. I'm Christian Rao here with my outstanding co-host, Sean Doyle. We are teaming up here for Slasher Sports and Jays from the Couch, giving you all 30 teams of MLB content all offseason long and bringing you into the 2023 season. Before we dig into the NL Central, Sean, we really got to dig into some breaking news that good old Jeff Passan broke today. As you know, life by Passan. You got it when you get a notification from him, you stop everything and you got to read it because there's something going on this offseason. And it looks like we got what we didn't really think was going to happen. And that is Boston Red Sox signed with the extension, a pretty interesting extension, pretty long extension, if you will, of Rafael Devers. They finally get the guy with they lost Mookie Betts, they lose Xander Bogaerts, but it looks like they lock in Rafael Devers. Before I get the details, what's your initial reactions of this extension?
Wow, 11 years was a long time, and in 2022, the Red Sox don't look to be competing for a division title or anything like that. So, it's kind of a good time for them to look ahead to the future, if you will. And I think solidifying the third base, the hot corner for the next decade, is a good way to start that. It's a lot of money, it's a lot of commitment, but if you're the Red Sox, what else are you going to do after losing Betts and Bogaerts, right? You can't let the last homegrown beast monster, if you will, leave for greener pastures, right? So,
right, yeah. According to Passan's story over on ESPN, he says that this 11-year, $331 million deal for Rafael Devers is the sixth most money ever, and it's more than 50% over David Price in money and 3 years longer than Manny Ramirez's deal. This is truly a blockbuster deal for the Boston Red Sox, and yes, they are not really in that competition window. When we talked about them in the AL East preview, we were pretty consistent with both you and I an opinion that they're probably going to be in the basement of the AL East. Now you lock in a guy like Devers for a lot of money for a long time. Sure, you can build around him, but you got to think it's going to take some time.
Oh, absolutely. But if we've seen anything from the Boston Red Sox over the last, 10, 15 years, it's that they know how to turn a ship around, and they'll be back in competition in no time. That's the one thing that you can't knock them out. When they're out, they're not down for long. So, if you're a Blue Jays fan or even an Orioles fan like yourself, you're going to enjoy it when the Red Sox take a little bit of a break, but you got to be rest assured that it's not going to be a long break.
All right, so just initial reactions, your last thought before we get into the NL Central. 11 years, $331 billion. When it's all said and done, will the contract be worth it for Rafael Devers and for the Boston Red Sox?
No, but no contract of that nature is. In 13 years from now, how great is Tatis Jr. going to be? All of those big money contracts, by the end of it, when you look at the last couple of years, you're not paying for that. You're paying for the front end of that contract. So, when all said and done, is it going to be worth, no, maybe not. But if you're the Boston Red Sox and a fan of the Boston Red Sox, more importantly, it's definitely worth it. You do whatever you can to keep your big guns in the holster, right? So, I don't get too caught up in terms and financial details about contracts like that. The bottom line is that the Red Sox fans are going to get to enjoy Rafael Devers for the next decade.
Yeah, at least they got that going for them at Fenway, because I do think it's going to be a pretty rough couple of years as they build back up. Because the rest of the teams in the AL East are on their way, well on their way. All right, let's do what we were set to do for today after we had a Passan bomb. We obviously had to talk about it before it started, but let's talk about the NL Central, Sean. This division, we talked about it off the air before we got started here as we were sitting in the lobby getting ready for the top of the hour here. And there's a lot of additions and subtractions. There's a lot of trades and a lot of quiet ones, if you will, inside this division. Every single team, I feel, has a storyline that can be very crucial this season, maybe not truly as a playoff contender, but moving forward into being a successful team in the future. And I gotta say that I think it starts with all the big additions that started with the Chicago Cubs. I really do think that there is just some really big moves that happened with Chicago. We have to talk about probably the biggest thing that happened in the division. Dansby Swanson comes over in the addition to the Chicago Cubs. That was a big contract. Every single shortstop really that that was a big name that goes somewhere, had a big contract this year. They go and take a risk on guys like Cody Bellinger. They take a risk on Jamison Teon. They take another risk on Eric Hosmer. Yes, they did lose Wilson Contreras to St. Louis. However, there's some really fun things about this team. I know last year they were in a complete rebuild. A lot of people questioned why they didn't make the trades at the deadline. Well, they seem to be doing a lot of moves here in the winter, Sean.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting, and of course I have a little bit of a horse in that race with Marcus Stroman previously playing in Toronto, and so I want the Cubs to do well, and Tyon's an interesting addition for them. When you look at 4 years, $68 million, it's 1 year longer, and I think $7 million more than Chris Bassett got from the Blue Jays, right? And this is they're kind of around that ballpark, that's kind of mid-tier starting pitchers. Tyon's an interesting guy, still able to pump it up to 94, mid-90s. He's what's interesting, though, last year was he had the second lowest walk rate at 4.4% of his entire career. Which is, obviously a great sign. You're heading into free agency. You want to put up, career high numbers. What is a little troubling, though, and I'll be paying attention when we're watching Tyon this summer, is that 90% contact rate in the zone. So, when you're throwing pitches in the zone and you're giving up that much contact, you're in for a rough season. And so the fact that he was able to keep his ERA under 4 last season was, I don't want to say miraculous, but it's certainly, kudos to him. And if he can maintain that in the NL Central, where the competition is a little bit different than say in the AL East when he was pitching for New York, I mean, maybe that this could be a rather sneaky good signing for the Cubs.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because now we're starting to see free agent signings, and this is, I guess, the second year, if you will, of pitchers moving back and forth between the NL and the AL, and now they don't have to worry about if they're going to bat or not, right? With the universal DH, I always think that's just an interesting concept. I think there's a very underrated addition as well for the Cubs, Brad Boxberger. I really like this addition. He's caused some havoc at some points within that division. He used to be on the Brewers, them coming over. I always love when a free agent signs to a different team within the division. It's like makes you think if there was maybe some possible bad blood between the old team and they just want to get back at that. Makes you wonder. We're going to talk about that obviously with Wilson Contreras going from red to blue. I mean, obviously one of the biggest rivalries in all of baseball. I'm really a big fan of what the Cubs have done so far this season. I know that there's a lot of what ifs, if you will, but what they were last year was not very good. And yes, they did have, I mean, let's be honest, they really weren't very good, but they do wind up keeping Happ. They do get rid of Contreras, even though they didn't really get anything for them like they thought they were going to at the deadline. But then you move into year 2 with a guy like Suzuki, who came over last year, was honestly a sensation. It was a breath of fresh air. What do you think year 2 looks like for him?
Actually, in all honesty, it could be even better. He's had a year under his belt to acclimate to, Major League Baseball, pitching, playing in the big leagues in the Major League Baseball over in North America. So I think that it will be interesting to see. Now he's projected to put up almost. It's really interesting. He's projected to put up almost the exact same numbers across the board with a little bit more power. So 26 home runs next year is his projection right now, and a weighted run created plus of 128, which again is a bit of an uptick for him as well. So, often you hear about this kind of second year slump, the sophomore slump, and I'll be interested to see whether or not that actually applies to Suzuki, because by all accounts right now, he's actually projected to do a little bit better than he did in his first year, which is actually kind of, exciting if you're a Cubs fan, right?
Yeah, it should be really exciting. I think this team has a lot of big names that you can get excited about. And honestly, that's something they really need, especially after them kind of saying goodbye to the 2016 big players of Chris Bryant, Anthony Rizzo, Kyle Schwarber, right? They got to get a new band together, if you will. And Dansby Swanson can help lead that charge with Suzuki, with, guys like maybe Bellinger, if he steps up and finds a new place, finds a new home. I'm really rooting for Bellinger. I was really hoping that last year was his year. Now he gets a 1-year deal here. You're going to hear me say this a lot on the show. There's not a 1-year deal I don't like. And Cody Bellinger falls in that category 100% because he has every opportunity right now to prove that what happened in Los Angeles at the end of the season, the last of his contract, if you will, was just a bad slump, and he can find a way to potentially get back to his MVP form. Speaking of one-year deals, it just happened today. Eric Hosmer does get a one-year deal. Pretty interesting thing happening here. The Chicago Cubs will only pay the minimum, $720,000. I would take that minimum. I don't know about you, Sean, but I would.
I mean,
this year to Eric Hosmer. He's not going to get paid $720,000, though. San Diego Padres are still on the hook for the remaining measly $38.3 million of the Eric Hosmer contract. You know, if you're only going to pay just a pennies on the dollar, if you will, compared to this contract, might as well go for it. Eric Hosmer had a great first half of the season last year with San Diego before all the moves happened, the Juan Soto trade where he wound up going over to Boston to finish his season. He has the opportunities. I had him in fantasy last year in our over on Jace from the Couch Fantasy Baseball League, and he did really good for me at the beginning of the year. I wound up dropping him later on, but I paid attention to his stats pretty closely. If he can find a way to have his first half season, the risk taker with Bellinger and Hosmer, this team could be a sneaky pick for the NL Central.
Yeah, I think, and that's what, when I think of the Eric Hosmer deal, I think that one probably encapsulates the kind of the overall feeling about the Cubs offseason. And that's there's nothing super flashy about their offseason. There's nothing, the major headlines aren't in Chicago, but there's a lot of take a chance. And if all of these kind of dominoes fall and everything falls into place the way that they hope it does, you're absolutely right. This Cubs team could actually challenge for the division title, assuming things go right for them. And it's a great gamble and very little risk in the case of Eric Hosmer. You're paying league minimum. It doesn't really cost you anything. The only thing better than that would be a minor league deal. So for them, it's a great signing because what have you got to lose? Right. And I think that's kind of where the Cubs are at this point. We're not going to be as bad as maybe Cincinnati, but maybe, if a few things go right for us, maybe we could be division champions, right? So I think that's kind of where they are. And I think the Eric Hosmer deal kind of is the best example of that.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And I'm not saying Eric Hosmer is going to be our MVP this season, but I do think that there is some opportunities for him to really make a big piece. I mean, he could be like what Anthony Rizzo at one point was for the Cubs. He could fill some of those voids. That would be the absolute ceiling. And I think Chicago fans would completely love if example came true. Last little part here before we move on from the Cubs. Now, they were really in a rebuild, if you will, after the whole 2016 team kind of moving on, the getting rid of Schwarber, Rizzo, Bryant, Baez. Do you think that what they done this offseason is enough for them to completely dig themselves out of this tunnel? Do you think that was enough to get out of the quote-unquote rebuild mode, if you will? Is that title now gone out of Wrigley Field? And do they have an opportunity to truly compete for the top of the NL Central?
Yes to the first part, no to the second. I think in all honesty, I think it is the beginning of the kind of the next phase of this return to competitiveness. They're starting to now make these bigger additions with Tyone and Swanson. So I think, it is the start, the rebuild. I don't want to say it's over. But I think it is kind of moving in the direction that fans would want it to, right? Because there's nothing worse for a fan, than a rebuild, right? Is it enough though? I think a lot of things have to go in their way in order to compete with the Cardinals in that division. But that doesn't mean though that they can't potentially compete for a wild card, a la Orioles last year, the way they kind of nobody expected them to, but they still did, right? And I think that if the Cubs are going to compete, it'll be in that wild card race, which may even be more exciting than some of the divisional races we see in baseball.
Yeah, that extra one little spot in the wild card race could really mean a lot for a team like the Cubs. Yeah. I feel like that extra spot makes some of these teams that are on the bubble, the fringe, if you will, put a lot more effort into the offseason, a lot more effort into some of those trade deadlines. So I know that some people were a little upset about the playoff edition. I think it's making way more competitive baseball now that we're looking at bigger picture, truly.
Yeah, I agree. I think that what the Mets are doing, I kind of, is almost the opposite in the sense they're kind of like hurting that competitive nature because they don't care about money anymore. You know what I mean? So I think the extra playoff spot allows the teams like even the Pirates, you know what I mean, to have a little bit of hope and then go out and make some moves to try and, maybe for the Cubs, maybe this is the year where things just happen to work out. Having that extra playoff spot to compete for makes it much more worthwhile.
I love it. All right, let's move on and let's talk about the Milwaukee Brewers. This is a team that looked really good last year for about 85-90% of the season. The final 10%, if you will, was, complete trash. Let's just be completely honest with ourselves here. I don't even know what happened. This team just fell off the face of the earth and didn't find themselves into the playoff race. It was a dream come true for a team like the Cardinals with Molina and Pujols last season. However, the Brewers did not look good. Basically, ever since they traded away the reliever in the offseason, or in the trade deadline, when all of that happened with Josh Hader, it kind of just untangled, if you will. And I know that's not one player isn't the complete glue to a team, especially from your bullpen. However, it did seem that way, Steve or Sean, doesn't it?
It absolutely did, and you never think that removing one player from a roster is what causes a team's collapse. But you're absolutely right. Trading Josh Hader had this kind of ripple effect, and at the time, I remember thinking, as a fan, I'm like, "Oh my God, what are you doing?" Like you're trading Josh Hader, the best reliever of the last 5 years at least, and you're trading him. But on paper, it looked fine. Right, because you've got Devin Williams, who's been almost as good as Hader himself. Right, so on paper it was like, okay, this is a baseball move. I get it. Sometimes those on paper moves end up to blow up in your face, and I think that's kind of what happened last year with Milwaukee. So this is their chance, though, now this offseason to kind of rework things and try and make another run for it. But I'm confused as to how that's going to happen given their offseason so far.
Yeah, the offseason so far is, I would say, a big question mark, and it truly makes you think that they are on their way to a rebuild because of the moves that they have truly made so far. So, for example, they haven't added anybody in free agency that wasn't considered a trade, right? So no actual free agent acquisitions. They did lose Taylor Rogers to San Francisco. He joins his twin brother over the Giants. Jace Peterson goes to Oakland. He was a pretty solid utility player for him. We already talked about Brad Boxberger going to the Cubs, a good guy in the bullpen. And Trevor Gott was fantastic for him last year. He kind of had a prove it year in Milwaukee. He gets himself a contract in Seattle. As for, they still added and subtracted as well with some trades. They probably were the most active team in all of baseball so far when it comes to the trade market. They got a catcher, Peyton Henry, from Miami. They traded away Hunter Renfroe to the Angels, which I thought was a very confusing move, if you will. They traded for some arms, and then they also traded Colton Wong to Seattle for Jesse Winker and Abraham Torren Hernandez. And then also, last but not least, truly not last but not least, they were part of that wild 3-team trade with Atlanta and Oakland. And I think they won that one. I don't know how they got themselves into that consideration, but they got William Contreras and then also got Owen Miller from Cleveland later on in the season. They made a lot of additions and trades. I just don't understand why they got rid of Hunter Renfroe. The Colton Wong one, just based on what I've heard from Milwaukee writers and Milwaukee fans, I think that was a time to take care of that one. I think his time in Milwaukee was ready to go. So I guess I understand that one. But losing Hunter Renfroe, then gaining Jesse Winker, you could call that maybe a wash, if you will. But one thing that Milwaukee really struggled with, not just last year, but it's been about 2 to 3 years, ever since Yelich has been down in the dumps, is offensive production. And getting rid of a guy like Hunter Renfroe can't be good for that, Sean. Not one bit whatsoever.
No, and I was looking at their lineup, and when you remove Hunter Renfroe from it, there's 30 home runs, and the only other guy to come close to that is Rowdy Tellez. And if your offense is relying on Rowdy Tellez, who's a former Blue Jay, so I can speak fairly confidently when I say this, that if your offense is entirely dependent on Rowdy Tellez, you've got problems, which makes me, like you, it makes me turn to the starting rotation, because if the Milwaukee Brewers were serious about a rebuild, they could do it in very short order if they were to dip into that starting rotation.
It's arguably the best rotation in baseball.
Yeah. Yeah. And they don't have the offense to go with it. That's the unfortunate part, right? And so Christian, think about how much starting pitching is going for, in the quote unquote open market, or in trades or whatever, right? Like this is a time that if Milwaukee were to seriously consider it, but if they are, then you don't make a move like bringing in Jesse Winker. This is why the Milwaukee Brewers are confusing me right now. I just don't know what they're doing, right? Because if they're going to rebuild, cool, I can get on board, I can see it, and I can see a path to making it very quick. If they're not, then I'm actually more confused, because I don't see how what they're doing is making them that much more competitive than they were last year.
Yeah, there are some pretty decent prospects that are coming up through the system in Milwaukee that, obviously we saw Jackson Torino, who has been just outstanding. I got the opportunity to watch him for the Carolina Mudcats last season when he was in low A. And then that was basically right before the big jump happened. I had the opportunity to see him, and he was outstanding. And then obviously there's some other players that were in Nashville that did really good as well. But I don't know if that's exactly what they're hoping for, to bring up just all those prospects and just hope that something sticks, throw a couple darts at the wall, and hopefully one of them lands on a triple or a bullseye. I just don't think that's the case for this strategy. I just don't see that happening. As for this rotation, you're completely right. They could rebuild if they want to very quickly. If we found out that Corbin Burnes was on the market, name a player, any player, that player can be traded for Corbin Burnes. Every single team would go out to try and find Corbin Burnes. Freddie Peralta would be another big one. If they wanted to move on for him, he's young enough he could stay with the rebuild if they wanted to make him the next ace for the rebuild, if you really wanted to. But you got Brandon Woodruff and Corbin Burnes, who arguably could both be an ace on some of the maybe some team in the MLB, not just Milwaukee. They could really rebuild fast, if you will. There's a lot of rumors about them blowing up this rotation, and I'm with you. I'm 100% with you. It just doesn't make any sense what they're doing right now to make you think that not at least one of those arms that we've just discussed has to be on their way out. It has to be, especially maybe not in this offseason, but maybe they give it one more half a season go. And maybe in the trade deadline, they decide, okay, we got to go to nuts and bolts here.
Yeah, and I would have thought that given how busy December was with regard to all of the offseason moves that happened, you would have thought that would have been the time. But in reality, maybe the smartest play of all is just waiting out all of that. And then last team standing with a plethora of starting pitching, the offers are going to look pretty good at that point, right? Because the season's about to start. Teams are going to get more and more desperate. And if you're a competitive team, looking with designs on a postseason spot, maybe, just maybe, with a Corbin Burnes or a Brandon Woodruff available, that's awfully tempting, right? So maybe it's a smart, slow play. I wish I felt that was actually what's going on here, but it could end up to be that way, because there's still lots of time left in the off season for something like that to happen.
All right, bold prediction alert. We got one coming right here. Here's my thoughts on this one while it's fresh in the head. I'm going to say that the Brewers are going to try for one half of the season. They're going to see if they can get themselves where they were at the beginning of last year, the top of the division. They feel good. They don't have a lot of injuries. If for some reason they are a bubble team or they are doing a lot worse than expected, let's say second place by a mile or even third or fourth in the division, then we see one of those players out the door, maybe even both. They decide, okay, that's the time for the rebuild come the deadline. I don't know if that's even a big, bold prediction, but let me even go farther then. If they are a bubble team, Corbin Burnes is not a Milwaukee Brewer by the end of the season. How's that?
Yeah, and I love it. The only issue I see with it is that it's a few months later than they should be considering it.
I agree.
Right. In all honesty, if we're talking about the Milwaukee Brewers, you're going to get just that much more value out of a Corbin Burnes if it's done in the offseason as opposed to at the trade deadline. Right. So it's almost like, I get it. You want to give it one last go for your fans, and maybe we can, pull some magic out of here. But if you're being realistic, and you and I, who, we don't necessarily follow the Milwaukee Brewers as closely as some people do, from the outside, it certainly looks like now is the time, as opposed to waiting to see, fingers crossed, that maybe the division is weak enough that you can make a run for it. But I wouldn't be taking that approach, that's for sure.
No, not at all. Not in a division that it looks like almost every single team has made some sort of addition to improve, especially the teams who are already towards the top. So, looking at the Cardinals and then now the Cubs, they are right in the thick of it. So I'm right with you at this one. All right, last conversation here about the Brewers. It's got to be about Christian Yelich. Kind of the same kind of situation with Cody Bellinger ever since that season where both Bellinger and Christian Yelich battled for the MVP. After that, both of them have completely just fell off the face of the earth. Really, the Brewers have struggled offensively ever since Christian Yelich has struggled offensively at the plate as well. There has been some injuries, but that is not the only reason why Yelich is struggling. I think he's just having a hard time at the plate. He's been doing it for a very long time in Milwaukee. Are we going to ever see him return back to MVP form? And if so, is it with the Brewers?
No. I don't think we are. I think that's what sometimes we forget about when you have players like a Mike Trout, for example, who are just perennial MVP candidates. We kind of get spoiled in thinking that that's a normal performance, a Shohei Ohtani performance, or even a Vlad Jr. performance who lost just to Shohei Ohtani. Those are kind of exceptional performances, right? And so the year that the Christian Yelich was at that MVP form, you can't bank on that lasting, right? And that's the risk. When we talk about Rafael Devers and the long-term deals, right? That's the risk that teams take on when they sign these deals, these long-term deals, is that there's going to be decline, right? And for some people, it happens sooner than later. So for some people, it happens, like falling off a cliff, and other people, it's a more gradual decline, right? And what we're seeing right now in Christian Yelich, I don't want to say whether it's surprising or not, but what I will say is that we're not going to see the previous Miami Marlins version of Christian Yelich anytime soon. And it's unfortunate, because you don't want to see, you wish guys could play forever. I still wish Carlos Delgado was swinging it for Toronto. So you hate to see it, but it is a natural part of the game. And unfortunately for Christian Yelich, I don't think we're going back there, right? Which is funny because just a quick little story. Back when he was playing for Miami and there was talk that he was going to be traded, Toronto Blue Jays fans were like, we want him now. Bring him in. And I remember talking to President Mark Shapiro on the phone about this. And we were just talking about not specifics, obviously, because he would never tell me anything like that, but just in general terms about looking at trading future value, right? And what can you expect out of a Christian Yelich over the next 10 years versus, and at the time, Vladdy hadn't come up yet. So if you compare the next 10 years of Vladdy versus the next 10 years of Christian Yelich, it kind of makes it, it's a no-brainer. You keep Vladdy, right? So it's just interesting to me because this idea of future value, Christian Yelich is a cautionary tale at this point, right? And the Milwaukee Brewers are like having to deal with it.
Yeah, it truly is a cautionary tale. It makes you wonder why a lot of these teams are not afraid to sign these 11, 12, 13-year contracts they've done in the offseason. Really, ever since Yelich signed his extension, and might I add, it was only a 7-year extension, not 11, not 12, not 13, $188 million, which was a lot a few years back before they started doing the $300 million contracts. He's only in year 3 of his 7-year deal. He's not a UDFA until 2030. And that's basically when his career will be over. So not only, and I asked the question if he'll be back in MVP form and if he'll ever be with the Brewers, or if he'll ever be with the Brewers in MVP form. I think he will be, because I don't know if they're going to find a way to get rid of him unless they do the Eric Hosmer kind of trade where they do a blockbuster for someone else and say, well, you got to take Hosmer. Let's get Hosmer out of here, and then find it, and then somehow the Boston Red Sox get a hold of him. So I'm with you. I really would love to see Christian Yelich take that next step forward and get back to where he was, or at least just be productive, because to be completely honest, he's not even, it's not just that he's not MVP form, he's not all-star form, and he's he's a starter. That's about it. And, that's good enough for a lot of people in Major League Baseball. I mean, I can't be a starter, but when you see what he was at one point in time, it's just almost disappointing. I'm sure he's not worried about his pocketbooks whatsoever, but I'm sure he wants to get his progress going as well. The Brewers need it.
Oh, yeah.
He absolutely need it. All right, so where we sit with the Brewers right now, you already heard my bold take. But before we're gonna get our predictions at the end here. But as you know, this team, I'm gonna call them the Brewers bubble for me, because that's exactly where I'm feeling this team is going to be all season long. I don't know if there's ever going to be a time where we see them in the lead in the NL Central because of just how many question marks I have for Milwaukee, Sean.
Yeah, no, I agree. I would agree with that 100%. The only thing that would keep them in any kind of race is that starting rotation and Rowdy Tellez. So, the chances are not good for them.
Well, there's one good trade that worked out for Milwaukee. Rowdy Tellez was a pretty good trade for them. I know it was on behalf of Toronto, but so far, at least there's something that they can, they'll tip their hat to. All right, let's move on to Cincinnati here. Cincinnati is a very interesting one. They started the season terrible. I mean, absolutely dreadful. Before the games even started, Cincinnati had probably the biggest storyline in all of baseball, with their owner saying, if you don't like it, you have no other choice. I'm here. The brown paper bags came out. I think they had one of the worst starting seasons of all time. It was bad. They did find a way to come back and kind of resurrect their season, if you will, a little bit. Joey Votto had some injuries, which was unfortunate. He took care of that at the end of the season. Canada's very own. We had to make sure I get a Joey Votto plug in there somehow. However, they did have some fun additions in the offseason. Before I get to the offseason, though, have to talk about they were probably the most active team in trades at the trade deadline. They made a lot of really good futuristic trades for their organization. They got rid of Luis Castillo, which obviously hurts, but the additions they got back were very, very good. They got some really strong packages. They have a very good farm system now, and that is fun to see for a team like Cincinnati, who is in the thick of it, a strong thick of it as a rebuild. I think that it's starting to get burnt edges, if you will, because they've been in the rebuild for so long. It's been cooking for quite some time here, Sean. But they do add a guy like Will Myers coming over for San Diego, who has had some great years in San Diego. He's had some ups and downs as well. I think it was just time for him for a new change of scenery with what San Diego's moving forward to. They get Luke Malley from Cleveland too, which I think could be a really strong piece if everything turns out good. And then they go and trade for some pretty interesting picks who have some youth still, have some potential, and I'm interested in see how they look in the Cincinnati organization. They get Nick Solak for Texas, who have had some good moments. Then now he gets traded for cash considerations. So basically just get him for almost nothing. So there's a really strong no risk in that one. Nick Solak could be really good. And then you get Kevin Newman from Pittsburgh, who I really like. Kevin Newman. I think that could be a really good addition for the Red system. And what I like about that pick is that he's an infielder, shortstop by trade, but it doesn't push their prospects right into the picture right away. It lets them marinate and boil and get ready for what's next. What's your thoughts about Cincinnati as I keep rambling on here about the Reds?
No, not at all. I mean, you gotta do what you can to try and make put lipstick on this this pig here, and I feel bad saying that because the Reds are they're going to be bad again.
They are.
But as you said, they're in the middle of a rebuild here. Right. And I think, as you said, that the additions or the trades that they made in past summer, I think that definitely helps them along the way. What I'm seeing when we talk about all of the things, the players that were brought in, the Nick Solaks, the Kevin Newmans and all of that, those to me scream further rebuild in again, another trade deadline. So you collect these resources, hope they work out, so that in July you can continue with that rebuild. You don't bring in a Nick Solak or a Kevin Newman if you have designs on competing, but you also don't bring them down. If you plan on losing 100 games either, right? So I think there's a purpose here.
Fast flips.
I think so. Yeah, and that's certainly what I would do. It's one strategy that I would consider if I were rebuilding a franchise. I would just collect assets and see what I can get for them later on, right? Because you have no expectation. But what I really do like about it, more than that, Christian, is this is a chance now for fans to really get to see, young players who are hungry, to establish themselves, right? And yes, a world championship and all of that stuff is why we watch it, and that's the ultimate celebration. But second to that for me is watching these young guys come up new to baseball and really kind of earn their place, right? And so if you're a fan of baseball, which, let's be real, if you're a fan of the Cincinnati Reds, you love baseball.
That's right. That's
so
true.
This might be the time. That's a really great summer for you.
Yeah, no, I really think you're right. Before we go any farther, if you're a fan of Cincinnati baseball, or if you're not a fan of Cincinnati baseball, if you get the opportunity in your life to go watch opening day in Cincinnati, it is the coolest thing by far. They close schools, they have parades. Like, it's what you wish every MLB team did. They do it in Cincinnati because the tradition and the history, and they really take that to heart. And I think that's why they got so upset about the comments that happened by their owner at the beginning of the season. Don't get me wrong. Obviously, they want to be successful, but even when they're not successful, they still have a pretty decent turnout. At least for opening day, they do, right? At least for opening day. I like your thoughts there, especially about a guy like Kevin Newman. I mean, yes, for Nick Solak, if you get cash considerations, if he does great and you can find a way to trade him for maybe an arm or something in the future, awesome. Maybe he can be a nice role player on a playoff team. Maybe like a Daniel Vogelback kind of guy that happened with the Mets last year, right? But I really like the idea of Kevin Newman maybe being, pushing himself to be a guy that can take off and get traded for maybe a little package of a prospect or two. Because, he, like I said earlier, he's a shortstop by trade, but you have 2, 3 shortstops. I'm pretty sure their top 3 prospects in the system all have shortstop next to their name. Now, De La Cruz can play a third base as well. He's considered the number 1 prospect, but Marte and Arroyo are both shortstops also by trade. So there's no way that you say that Kevin Newman is the future for the Cincinnati Reds. So I love the idea of saying that he's probably on the move as well. So we're probably going to see maybe a half season out of Kevin Newman, and I'm completely okay with that, because I wouldn't be surprised if we saw De La Cruz or Marte in the Cincinnati organization in the major league level this year. MLB Pipeline does say their ETA is 2023 this year, and I completely agree. I think we're going to see at least one of them. These are some of those guys that we saw from these big trades in the trade deadline. They rebuilt their farm system, and their farm system is really good. In the draft, they got Cam Collier, who they got him, I think, he fell right to them, and they did a really good job in the draft as well. They weren't afraid to sign some money for him. Cam Collier immediately moves up to their 4th prospect in the system. He's going to be a couple of years to marinate, but when he comes up, I'm really looking forward to seeing him. If you paid attention to college baseball at all last season, but they have some really good prospects, and we're not going to dig too much into prospects with some of these teams, but this is a team that you really got to pay attention to, because I think we're going to be talking about their top prospects like we talked about the Orioles' top prospects for the next couple of years, like how we talked about Grayson Rodriguez, how we talked about Adley Rutschman, Gunnar Henderson. I think we're going to talk about the Cincinnati Red prospects this year like we did with Baltimore, Sean. Yeah.
Oh no, absolutely. If you're a Cincinnati Reds baseball fan, what you're watching for this year, you're actually watching for 2 or 3 years from now. Like that, it's just to kind of get used to these guys and see what they can do, and let them, the young kids play and all of that stuff. And what you're seeing on the field this year in 2023 from the Reds may not be there. Looking around the diamond at the Kevin Newmans and all of that stuff, like even the Spencer Steer, who's, projected to start at third base, who doesn't have the traditional power of a third baseman. This is what happens in the context of the Red season, right? You're going to get guys who aren't necessarily prototypical at different positions, but you're going to let the young kids play, because in a few years, you're going to be good, right? And that's what Cincinnati Reds fans have to look forward to this year.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to actually watching Cincinnati Reds baseball this year, because there is going to be a lot of great storylines. About the Will Myers thing, we kind of talked about Kevin Newman a little bit. Is he a guy that will be flipped, or is he a guy that comes in strictly for the veteran leadership for this squad?
Man, that's a great question. I wish I knew why they signed Will Myers, to be honest with you. Ever since he I believe he was Rookie of the Year with Tampa Bay. I remember his big old hairdo. Yeah. Yeah, the
No
whole
glove
thing.
guy. That's all I remember is that he
Yeah.
always, no gloves, and that's to keep in mind. But yeah,
Yeah,
I
he
think
looked like a big
I think he's a fun
stoner
player,
during
though.
his interview. Like that's all that's all I really remember. And then he goes out to San Diego and kind of disappears as far as baseball relevancy goes. A la Eric Hinsky, Blue Jays Rookie of the Year in 2003, I believe. My years may be off, but again, solid breakthrough and then kind of off the cliff. So what is Will Myers for the Cincinnati Reds? He's a name. Let's be real. He's a name. He's gonna draw some interest. He may, if he can kind of find his performance and whatnot. Maybe he's a flip candidate. But at the end of the day, too, even though a team is rebuilding, they still need position players and they still need players to play the game, right? So, to me, if Will Myers is not flippable, I'll just make up words now, if that's okay.
Let's do it.
If he's
okay.
not flippable,
it's okay.
It's okay. It's the OK Baseball podcast, so it's going to have to be.
Okay.
But yeah, no, I think if he's not flippable, then it's just let's get somebody who can play first base and some outfield, because Joey Votto, not getting younger, does get hurt. It's not like they're not going to need a first baseman.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Very good point. And you do need some sort of veteran leadership, even a good transition, if you will, too. Even if we find out sooner or later that it's going to be Joey Votto's last year, because we know that's coming around the corner at some point. That's going to be such a bittersweet moment when that happens. All right, last question on the Reds here. We already talked about their prospects. We talked about some of their additions, and we know that they're not going to be a great team this year. But do you feel like they are in the right direction as a franchise, and can they find themselves not in the basement once the season is over of the NL Central?
Yeah, I actually do think they are headed in the right direction. And then, like as you said, the trade deadline and stuff went a long way to that. Absolutely, it did. But one thing I really like, and the reason I'll be following the Reds more closely than I have been, is their starting rotation with Lodolo and Green. Those are two guys who, man, they are going to be good. And that's not an insignificant place to start if you're in a rebuild. So for me, their starting rotation is something that I would be excited about if I were a Reds fan, for sure.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, I'm looking really forward to this one. And obviously, if you need a good game to watch on opening day, you can always check out the festivities from Cincinnati. All right, let's talk about another team who seems like has been in a rebuild forever. People like to make jokes to say this is the minor league team of the MLB. Another one that loves to get picked on for their owner, not afraid to spend any money. I feel like I can go on and on about the Pittsburgh Pirates, and I know a lot of people who are fans of the Pirates and who follow us on other platforms will probably agree as well. But the Pittsburgh Pirates actually made some additions in the free agency this year, and they are significant compared to years past. Let's put it there. I think that's a fair way to say it. It's significant compared to years past. They add a guy like Rich Hill, who is going to be able to probably apply for AARP this year. Carlos Santana comes in to a team that could be a really interesting pick. I don't know. It could be good, could be not. I mean, we'll see that one. Yeah, that one's a could be, right? Vincent Vasquez, he's a good bullpen piece. He has had his moments. Jarlin Garcia, and also another good piece. And then Austin Hedges as well. I thought that one was actually a really interesting pickup with all the needs for catchers in this offseason. Austin Hedges moves to Pittsburgh. He's probably the worst offensive catcher in all of baseball, but one of the best defensive catchers in all of baseball. He goes over to the Pirates system. That could be something good for the young pitching core of Pittsburgh. However, I just found that one really interesting. That was the additions in free agency. Now, I got to tell you about this blockbuster trade they make. They go get this guy named G-Man Choi from Tampa Bay. All right. Obviously, we talk about the trading away Kevin Newman. He goes to Cincinnati. And then they also get Connor Joe from Colorado, who now they got G-Man Choi and Connor Joe on the same team. I mean, if you wanted to get anything trending, if you wanted to get some hype going on your squad, you got G-Man Choi and you got Connor Joe. So you're going to be just fine, Pittsburgh. But I know you got some thoughts about G-Man Choi and your thoughts here. What do you think about Pittsburgh so far with their offseason? I'm actually kind of surprised, and I'm a little optimistic, if you will.
Yeah, I wish I had something sort of new to say about about the Pirates, because I feel like you said, like we it feels like it's been the same storyline year after year after year. Now Ben Cherington is kind of flipping things a little bit and actually, making moves. Again, no blockbusters or anything like that. And maybe, again, this is asset collection. Ben Cherington, one thing he's very good at is building a farm system. And he had no small role in rebuilding Toronto's system just before he went to Pittsburgh. So I think, maybe there's some asset building, but maybe not. Maybe, just maybe, there's a bit of, the division isn't as strong as it has been. Maybe there's some hope that they can challenge for a wild card spot. I doubt it. But I think that if you look at those moves, like the first base is really interesting to me. Ji-Man Choi is no small addition to. I would love to have him on my team, even though playing for the Rays, I watched him, and I told you this little story before we went on air, but I might as well tell everybody. I actually have a respect for Ji-Man Choi that makes me hate him. Playing for the Rays, playing for the division rival, but he, in a game, as a joke, he switch hit against the Blue Jays, and I believe on the second pitch, hit it out as a joke, right? Like, this is like, the bat to ball skill is incredible. He's got power, great defensive first baseman. So, this is not a small move for the Pirates. A championship team could do very well, as the Rays have done, with Ji-Man Choi at first base, right? So this is not small for them. And Connor Joe will play the outfield. And then, if they mix in some DH time, maybe Choi gets some DH time as well. But switch hitter with some power, great contact skill, and just like, I hate using the term because I feel like it's cliche at this point, but he's a professional hitter, right? Like, he knows what he's doing in there. And that's a big addition for the Pirates, I think.
Yeah, and you got to think that they're not done making moves, and it might not be their choice. I think that they have something that they have to take care of, some unfinished business, and that's Brian Reynolds. And he did, if you don't know, in this offseason, he did request a trade. There was a lot of talk of saying he might get moved in the trade deadline last year. That never happened. I think it looked like he wanted that to happen because he requested a trade this offseason. There has been some rumors spoiling around about him possibly moving to Miami, him possibly going to a team like New York. It looks like Pittsburgh is looking for an arm to get back into the mix, and I think
a leg,
arm and a leg. It looks like that would be, and it's true. It looks like they're looking for a lot for Brian Reynolds, and it's hard to disagree with them because he's a great player. He was an all-star caliber player. Why would you want to get rid of a guy who really, I'm sure that they were trying to build around, and that's just not in their favor. However, if they got to move him, it seems like that's what's going to happen eventually. I'm sure that we're going to hear that happen before spring training. Would be surprised if we hear that happen before March starts. But what's your thoughts about Brian Reynolds? Where do you see him going? And what do you think that they could possibly get back in return?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, it's not... When you first hear that a player is requesting a trade, especially from a team like Pittsburgh, it's like, okay, the player believes that the team is trash and they're not going anywhere, so they don't want to play there. And that may not necessarily be true. For all we know, Brian Reynolds is saying, okay, look, the context of our team means I'm probably going to be traded at some point. I would rather you do that in the offseason so I can move my family, get everything sorted, and just make life easier. Right. So when we say like he requested a trade, maybe all it is that he requested that trade be done in the winter as opposed to the summer. Right. So after the initial sticker shock of requesting a trade, like you can see and even if it is just he doesn't want to play in Pittsburgh anymore, you can kind of see that too. But if you're the Pirates, you are going to get as much as you can. Look around at the trades that have been made. For Dalton Varsho, the Blue Jays gave up the top catching prospect in all of baseball, plus one of the better outfield contracts in all of baseball in Lourdes Gurriel, right? So Brian Reynolds is going to cost. Yes. And if I were the Pittsburgh Pirates, it would be pitching. I would not trade Brian Reynolds for anything less than a potential ace. Obviously, I'm trying to think of somebody maybe in like Tampa Bay, Luis Patino, that kind of name that I would, not that I'm suggesting there's a fit there, but something like that, right? Somebody who has huge upside and is very close to taking a rotation spot at the very least, and then I would keep going. I'd be looking for one position player. I'd be looking for a bullpen arm. I would be asking for the moon because if you're making all these other moves, maybe you feel like you are being competitive, and if that's the case, it's going to take that much more to trade a Brian Reynolds, I think.
Yeah, you're right. And let's be speculative here. Let's talk about that potential where if they could get a potential ace or at least somebody, for them it might be an ace, it might be a 2 or 3 starter on the team they trade for. Let's say example, I know that Nestor Cortez was in the possible conversations for the Yankees. Pablo Lopez was in possible conversations for the Marlins. Let's say they get a guy like that, and then they also get another, let's say just utility player. Let's just put that in the context. Let's say that's what they get. What does that put Pittsburgh in the NL Central? Where does that put them? Does that obviously doesn't make them a 100-loss team anymore? Does that put them kind of where Chicago was last year, around 75 wins? Does that get them to the 80 mark? Where does that get them for next season?
Yeah, I don't think trading Brian Reynolds is going to get you to 500, regardless of the return. Like the guy plays every day and contributes to the team every day, getting a starting pitcher like a Pablo Lopez every 5th day, right? So even just that alone, logically, I don't see it playing out. And that's even if it was a 1-for-1 type deal, which, I don't think if I'm Pittsburgh, I'm not going for a 1-for-1 deal, even if it is Pablo Lopez. I want more, right? For that very reason. So do I see this is not the trade that puts Pittsburgh back into contention? Right. And I think that fans kind of have to kind of realize that as much as they are attached to Brian Reynolds, the return that they're going to get is going to be huge, but it's not going to be franchise altering. And all of a sudden you're a playoff contending team this year, maybe not even next year. Right. So we got to kind of hedge our expectations there a little bit. That being said, it's definitely what they've done already is enough to avoid losing 100 games this coming season. So I could see them, maybe 10 games under 500, maybe flirting with 500 for a little bit, certainly maybe beginning to mid-season, but I don't see them, ending up certainly with a huge boon in the standings.
Yeah, I could see that around maybe like 72 to 77 games right now as a win column.
Yeah.
I think that's fair. I think that's fair, especially right now. And if that's the case, you had 62 wins last year. So if you could find a way to improve and do good and keep building around your core and trade away some of these guys like we talked about, it wouldn't be a bad idea. All right, here we go. Let's talk about the St. Louis Cardinals. We talked about the beginning of the show how Dansby Swanson was probably one of the biggest free agency splashes. Well, Wilson Contreras was also a huge splash because he probably had to fill the biggest role in baseball this offseason, and that was filling the shoes of Yadier Molina. They get it inside a division. That is really interesting because if you know anything about St. Louis baseball, when they get a free agent, they usually just hold on to them for a very long time. So they feel like Wilson Contreras is the guy that is going to probably finish his career in the red uniform. I'm really, really excited about Wilson Contreras being behind the plate for St. Louis. I do think that is a great addition. I mean, I think I've had some conversations. I have some really close friends who are St. Louis fans. When we talk about it, I thought that the best possible situation was to go and get Contreras, obviously without a trade. This was a great pickup for St. Louis. They did lose Jose Quintana in a trade or in free agency to the Mets. I don't know if that's a huge thing for them. However, there has been a lot of question marks for St. Louis with the rotation. We'll get into that in a minute. But first, what is your thoughts about Wilson Contreras moving over to St. Louis, and how do you feel about him fulfilling the next? I mean, is he the next Yadier Molina for this team?
No.
That could be there for the next 5-10 years plus.
Well, he'll be there for 5 for sure, but he's not going to be the next Yadi Molina. I don't think because let's be real, and this is no disrespect to Yadi Molina or anybody in St. Louis or any fans in St. Louis, but Yadi Molina was only that valuable to the St. Louis Cardinals. Okay. he meant more to the Cardinals than to any other team or to any other fan base, right? So there's that, kind of the icon that is Yadi Molina. It's very kind of regional. I'll put it that way.
You're right. No, true. Yeah.
So he's not going to be able to, Wilson Contreras is not going to be able to replace that, right? And that would be his biggest mistake if he went in there and said, I now have to fill Yadi's shoes, right? And if the St. Louis Cardinals were smart, they would put his locker on the opposite side of the room from Molina's, like erase any kind of connection, right? Because you're not going to be able to do that. Is he going to be able to replicate Yadi's numbers, in his prime? Yeah, absolutely. On both sides of the ball, he's an excellent replacement for Yadi Molina. The problem is that it's not going to appear that way, and almost no matter what he does, right? Because Yadi is such an icon in St. Louis, and that's the one thing I think of. Like, yep, they've got a great replacement, probably the best replacement they could have found, but it's still not. And just like Albert Pujols, don't even try. Do not even try to replace Albert Pujols. Let him walk off into the sunset. He had probably the best end to his career that anybody could have envisioned, especially after the previous few seasons, right? So don't even try. Just let him go. But Yadi Molina, you got to replace it. Like, you have to try, and you have to. So the St. Louis Cardinals were kind of stuck because they're not going to not do anything, but they're also, no matter what they do, we're not going to replace Yadi. So it was an interesting move, but it was kind of like the only one they really could have made, if we're being realistic. Now, as far as their pitching staff goes, Christian, that is a big question mark.
Yeah, super big question mark. And you're right about Yadier Molina and the shoes filled and the regional legacy, if you will. I think they had to do something, though. I think they had to add a catcher, not just because of the whole Yadi thing. I just don't think they had enough talent on the roster for a catcher position. So I like what Wilson Contreras is going to add to this team. I think it makes them better. And I'm completely 100% with you. I don't think they have to replace Albert Pujols. He had a great season for what it was. I think when he was signed initially, I think there were some thoughts that maybe he might get DFA'd at some point, right? So whatever he did and had the season he had was just a nice feeling, and it was great. So they were very happy to where that was at. They don't need to replace Albert Pujols. Yes, let's talk about this pitching rotation because it needs to be discussed. It's a big question mark. Obviously, they made some trades last year in the trade deadline. They got Quintana. They got Jordan Montgomery. Montgomery was fantastic for him. They traded Harrison Bader for him to New York, which was unfortunate for their speed and for their outfield help. But they really needed Montgomery, and he did good down the stretch. My biggest question, and I feel like this might be a lot of people's questions in St. Louis or who would follow St. Louis, is what the heck is going on with Jack Flaherty? Yes, there is a lot of injuries. There's a lot of question marks with him, but he was built to be this ace, if you will. And I don't know if it happened too soon. I don't know if that was the issue with him, but ever since he has been kind of designated as St. Louis's ace, he hasn't lived up to that title whatsoever. And he's coming up on a payday option really, really soon. And my mind says you got to find a way to cut ties, move on from him while there's still value. I don't think that he and the St. Louis Cardinals, if I'm in St. Louis's shoes, I'm not signing Jack Flaherty to an extension, Sean.
Yeah, that's a tough call. I'm glad I don't have to make that decision, because Jack Flaherty has all the talent in the world, and he's still 27. Like there's, it's not like he's 34 and aging, like almost like Adam Wainwright, who apparently refuses to get old, which is good for him. It's just such a fascinating thing with him because I'm just looking now at the innings. We're going to throw out 2020, but even in 2020, only 40 innings. 2021, 78 innings. 2022, 36 innings. And then so we go back, 2019 was 196. 2018 was 151. So it's been a long time since he's thrown a full season of baseball. That is going to impact, and he's a free agent at the end of the 2023 season. That's going to be tough. Do you even give him a qualifying offer?
I personally don't do it. And exactly your stats alone tell me exactly why. The last
Right.
3 seasons, or 2.5 seasons, if you want to count COVID year as a half year, those last 2.5 seasons, innings wise, don't even add up to his inning total in 2019, which wasn't even a full season of innings from this guy. So yeah, I just can't do it. Because you know that he's going to want number one ace money, and I think he deserves it because I think he just needs a change of scenery. I think he can get back to where he needs to be. But if I'm St. Louis and I've already seen the injuries, unless you know a lot more, because I mean, we don't know behind the scenes. We don't know what their training department's doing, their all that stuff with Flaherty. If they know a lot more, then they're going to do it. One thing that I will say about St. Louis is this: they do pretty dang good with contract extensions. There hasn't been a contract extension that we have seen from this team in a very long time that has gone sour. Paul Goldschmidt's done really good. We know Nolan Arenado has done really good. And those are just some of the recent ones. We can probably go back quite a bit, even with some of their pitching. I just thought they were going to add a little more in this. This is a guy now. There's no way that if the bubble Brewers go on the market, that a guy like Corbin Burnes is going to St. Louis. I mean, it would. There's no way that they're going to trade Corbin Burnes inside the division. But this is a guy, or this is a team that, if one of those guys from Miami come on the market, I feel like the Cardinals are going to be all over them. Absolutely, all over them.
And I would take that even a step further, Christian, and I would add that it's almost Miami and St. Louis are almost a perfect fit, right? Because Miami needs outfielders. St. Louis, all winter, we've been hearing about Dylan Carlson and Lars Nootbaar and Tyler O'Neill, and they have depth in the outfield position, right? And they need starting pitching. Let's be real here. You're looking at a rotation right now that includes Miles Mikolas as your ace, Jordan Montgomery, Adam Wainwright, Jack Flaherty, and Steven Matz, right? This is where the St. Louis Cardinals are. That's not enough to win a division. It might be enough to win this division in this year, but not without an addition. I really believe that St. Louis is going to have to do something with their starting rotation, and maybe it's a Jack Flaherty issue. Maybe he solves it for them and is on the IL again. Maybe he comes back and they can save them, but who knows, right? That's a lot of maybe. I agree that I think they need to be looking at that rotation, and I would be looking to Miami and using one of the outfielders as bait there. There might be a really good fit with those two teams.
Yeah, if I'm Miami and if I'm St. Louis as well, I'm looking at Tyler O'Neill. Tyler O'Neill had which I thought could have been an MVP season to start the year. What we saw from him last year in 2021, I was really hopeful that Tyler O'Neill could be a potential MVP. He was anything but that last season, but the potential is there. And he doesn't have a long contract right now, like a Christian Yelich. So if you're not afraid to take a risk on a guy like Tyler O'Neill, who has all the potential in the world, and he's fast. I mean, he is super fast. He's very athletic. At the worst, you're going to get probably one of the best defenders in all of baseball in the outfield. I'm going for Tyler O'Neill. And I think St. Louis, compared to Dylan Carlson, compared to Lars Nootbaar, would probably rather part ways with them because I think he's closer to a contract, and they got to keep spending money and pay attention to all those other infielders in there. St. Louis has a young core as well. So my guess is that if any outfielder's on the move for St. Louis, it's Tyler O'Neill, and I'm right with you. I think Miami is a perfect fit for a guy like him to move over for some arms. All right, let's get into this here. We are just over time here, so let's get our last picks for the NL Central. Right where we sit right now, where we are very close to obviously crowning the 2023 World Series champion, we got to make sure that we get our predictions for the NL Central. So, Sean, I'm going to give it to you first. You're 1 through 5. Where do you see this NL Central finishing once the season is over?
Yeah, so I'm going to start at the bottom, and I think it's Cincinnati approaching another 100-loss season. It is what it is. I don't think that's a condemnation or anything like that. I think it's just the reality of their situation. I see Pittsburgh in 4th. I see the Cubs in 3rd. I see the Brewers in 2nd, only because of their starting rotation. And it would not take much. A mosquito could fly by my ear and fart, and I would change my mind. That's how, I could flip-flop those two teams. But I do think the Cardinals are just so strong. Any team that has Nolan Arenado on one side of the infield and Paul Goldschmidt on the other, with Tommy Edman as their shortstop, and the list goes on and on. These guys are solid all around the diamond, right? And yes, there are questions with their starting rotation, but even their bullpen is very solid as well. A lot of flamethrowers coming out of that bullpen. So I think a lot would have to go wrong for for St. Louis to fall out of that division lead.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think St. Louis is going to win the NL Central this year, even though that their biggest question mark is the rotation. I think that's going to be the easiest thing to take care of at the trade deadline when they look to buy. So, and I think that is what happens. That's why I have Cardinals number 1. I'm going to go with the Cubs as number 2. I think the Cubs are going to surprise some folks here, and I think that they're going to really get themselves into the wild card contention. And I think that they find themselves potentially being that last seed in National League. I'm going to give the Brewers number 3, but I think there's a large gap. I think we are going to really have a true bubble Brewers, if you will, where they struggle at the trade deadline and they do make that decision to sell. I'm going to stick with that hot take. Then I'm going to go with the Pittsburgh Pirates in 4th place. I do think that they are going to be a lot better than that 100-loss season last year. And the Reds in 5th. I don't think any team in this division has 100 losses. I think at the worst, the Reds have 99. But I don't think we see any triple-digit losses. I don't. I think every team will improve, if you will, with the exception of Milwaukee. I think every team in this division will improve with the exception of Milwaukee this year. Milwaukee steps down. They had 86 wins last year. I mean, initially right now, based on what we're seeing, 80 is a stretch for me. It really is. Even with that rotation, I think they have a lot of work to do. The offensive production, I just have a lot of question marks for them. So a lot of issues there.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, and it could go either way for Milwaukee too, right? You know, they could, as we said, things could just go and well for them the whole way through, and they could actually end up looking to buy at the trade deadline as well, because they know they're not a playoff team yet, right? So if they look at get there at that trade deadline and they say, hey, we may actually have a shot here, you know what, like the 2015 Blue Jays did, right? Just, hey, wait a minute, this division is gettable. Maybe they pull off a couple of moves and they're right in it.
I love it. Absolutely. I love it. Drixley sends us a message here saying this has been a great show. I agree. This has been a fantastic show. We are going to come at you. I know we had a long break between our last show. We're going to come at you next week with another preview to make up for missing some time. We're going to hit the AL Central next time. We're going to take care of the middle divisions. Really excited for that one. I hope you guys enjoyed our NL Central preview. Obviously, we talked about Rafael Devers and the big extension as well over for the Boston Red Sox. Be sure to hit like and subscribe. Give us some comments while you're there. We will get back to all of those comments as soon as we see them, so we can definitely join the conversation. Talk baseball all off season long. It's been fun. Sean, where can they find you and all your work so we can get some more stuff going here for this great baseball off season?
Oh, absolutely. Well, you can follow me on Twitter right there at DoyleJFTC. Of course, you can catch all the Blue Jays specific content that Jays from the Couch offers there on jaysfromthecouch.com. We're on YouTube. 3 great shows, not 1, not 2, but 3 great shows. If you're a Blue Jays fan, there is no other place for you than Jays from the Couch.
That's right, 100%. And you can find more of all 30 MLB teams here at the OK Baseball Podcast YouTube channel, where we drop videos all the time, including some nice YouTube shorts. So be sure to check it out. Hit like and subscribe. Join the conversation. We'll be here all off season long. Have a good week, everyone. We'll see you back here next week.